Alrighty, Mighty, here we go. It's Big Hairy News, and we are joined by Jeremy Elwood. Jeremy, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Pat.
Lovely to be with you. I feel like we're rekindling something of years gone by.
Yeah, it does feel kind of familiar, doesn't it? Yeah.
But thank you. People who are joining us, this is the first of something we're trying to do. We're calling it Big HN, Big Hairy News. Now, let me be clear. Okay, we see the beards and we see the facial hair. It's not about that. It's about the big, hairy story of the day. You know, we talk about big, hairy, audacious goals. This is about the big, hairy news stories of the day and having a chat about them and having a chat with people who have opinions on them, who know about them, who are involved in them. So, Jeremy, thanks for jumping in on this one. We're going to attempt, and I'll say attempt because, look, this is a bit of a soft launch, as people in the entrepreneurial world would say. We're going to attempt to do this every day at 11 a.m. And so hopefully if you are watching this or are going to watch this, you are more than welcome to join in. Sharing what we do would be amazing. And also contributing. Our aim is to be live sort of between 11 and 12 most days, all days really, all weekdays. And your comments from watching will also be valued and added to the conversation as well. So, for example, today at about 1:45 midday, we're going to have Professor Robert Patman from Otago University joining us talking to Ukraine. And in the next 5 minutes or so, we are going to have Tom Much, who many of you may have seen over various media outlets. He is a Kiwi journalist based in the Ukraine. He was reporting from Kiev when the bombs were landing. He's since found, I was going to say safety. Jeremy, it's so weird saying safety when someone's stuck in the Ukraine, but he's more safe moving west with a whole bunch of other refugees as well. And he's due to dial in the next 5 minutes or so. So hopefully we'll have him on board. But Jeremy, thanks again for joining us. I mean, you are a well-known comedian, 7 days, stand-up tours, but also since you and I last kind of connected with any kind of projects, you were also doing work with the project on their team previously. What was it like getting involved in the news world as sort of someone shaping the news, which is sort of what we're doing here?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was with the project for the first 3 years of its existence. With phenomenal timing, I decided to move on and go freelance 10 days before the first lockdown. So that was superb for the bank balance. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I've always been, as you know, kind of a news addict. So I've generally kept in touch with what's happening in the world and within our own country. But to be right in the middle of it was certainly interesting. I mean, just the when you really get an idea of the pace of news. I know the mainstream media has been getting a really hard time recently, but people don't understand quite how hard people do work to try and get those stories and try and get them out on time and correctly.
Yeah. Now, you appreciate that when we're going live with a daily news show, that there's going to be some things that come and go. There's going to be things we hit, things that we miss. We're going to sometimes set up conversations and interviews, and sometimes they're not going to come through. I'm preaching to the choir with you, Jeremy, because you've done this work, obviously, through the project. Just so you know, literally, as we're talking, Tom Much, who is in the Ukraine right now, has just messaged me saying he's going to be just a second or two. So we will have a chat with him when he comes up. But look, why don't we actually have a look at what's going on in the Ukraine while we wait for Tom to come on board. One of the things that's coming out in the news, Jeremy, and I'd be interested to get your perspective on this, is we're getting a lot of conversations in some news outlets that even though Russia seems to have somewhat wandered into Kiev, that actually the resistance that they're facing is a lot better than they thought. And I was wondering, I see on a BBC News article here that some of Ukrainians' most experienced troops are dug in along the line of contact, and because they've been fighting the Russian-backed separatists for the past 8 years. And whilst I'm not suggesting that the underdogs are going to come out victorious on this one, I am interested as to what happens with these battle-hardened Ukrainian soldiers, albeit massively outpowered and outnumbered, who have been fighting for a decade, people who have wanted Russia to take over Ukraine anyway, but not on a Putin, well, might have been on a Putin-led expedition, but more under the radar. So they've been doing this for a long time, and now I guess this is their ultimate challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got one word, and it's Afghanistan. The West has consistently not paid as much attention to the fact that when you're fighting people who are defending their homeland, especially in the Russian case. I mean, most of the Russian troops are conscripts. They're they're not volunteers. They're not necessarily battle hardened. Whereas the Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland, and as history showed for over 100 years in Afghanistan, is you can't downplay that. You're on their turf. They have an absolute reason for resisting, and it's never going to be easy. I mean, Afghanistan was known as the graveyard of the West for very good reason. And like you say, even though they're outmanned, outgunned, under-equipped in comparison, they have a reason for fighting. And I think the longer this drags on, I mean, I think various reports I'm reading is that Putin's maybe surprised and disappointed that this has taken as long as it has. He thought it might be over in a couple of days, and that's just not going to be the case. The longer this drags on, the harder it's going to get, because morale in the Russian troops is going to falter. The world is paying more and more attention. I mean, you look at the EU today announcing that for the first time in its history, it's going to purchase and deliver arms to the Ukrainians. I mean, that's just never been done before. It's in many ways, this is an unprecedented situation, but in other ways, historically, again, going back to Afghanistan and the Middle East, this is a mistake that superpowers have made time and time again. Winston Churchill described Afghanistan as the graveyard of the West, nearly 100 years ago.
Yeah, you can probably include Vietnam in there as well for superpowers.
Absolutely, yeah.
Hey, listen, I also want to get to the kind of what we're seeing and the spirit, I guess, of the Ukrainian people, and that absolute fucking gangster woman who told that Russian soldier that he better have sunflower seeds in his pockets. If you haven't seen that, we will play that clip shortly for you. But right now, we are going to cross live to the Ukraine. Tom Much is a New Zealand reporter based in the Ukraine. We've all been reading his stories, following his Twitter as to what's going on. And Tom, welcome to Big Hearing News. And the first question is, are you safe? Are you safer than you were? How are you?
I'm safer than I am, thank you very much. I'm currently actually in a hostel in Lviv, which is now doubling as a refugee shelter for people who are fleeing the other parts of Ukraine that are much more dangerous. Just to briefly explain, the western parts of Ukraine near the Polish border, they're the places that have seen the least fighting, although we did hear a couple of air raid sirens throughout the day, so it's not completely safe. But being here for the last few days, I have to say, was utterly crazy. There was rockets flying down. There was constant shelling in the streets. There were armed men everywhere. It was one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life.
I'm reading reports as well that the Ukrainian government has said all men aged 18 to 60 kind of need to stand and take up their arms. Is that what you're seeing on the ground actually there? Are you, when you're moving west, moving away from the area, is it all sort of the women and children who are going that way, and are the men literally staying behind in their houses ready to fight?
So the men aren't allowed to leave the country. Men aren't allowed to leave the country. Men have been issued weapons. They've been told they have to go and fight no matter what. They've been issued with AK-47s, and they've been given instructions on how to make Molotov cocktails. So yes, it mostly is women and children playing with. But as I said, I've spoken to many young women who've said, I'm sorry, I don't want to leave my father, my brother, my husband on their own, and they've decided to stay. Many other women have decided to take up arms as well. There's a decent number of women in the territorial services and the volunteer brigades as well.
We were just talking, Jeremy and I. Oh, you go, Jeremy.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask. I mean, I was reading reports today that there's a 13-kilometer queue at the Polish border to get over the border. I mean, is that going as smoothly as it can, sort of the exodus to get people out of the country?
Well, I mean, you've got to remember that the kinds of numbers we're talking about. We're talking about literally millions of people who might be wanting to leave Ukraine. And so far, it has just been the case that there simply isn't the infrastructure available to get everybody over the border. Yes, it is true. I know people who walked for literally 20 kilometers trying to get to the border. And there have been actually some unfortunate situations where people of certain nationalities, African nationalities, South American nationalities, have been turned back. Poland has said that, oh no, you don't have the right passport or the way to enter, and they've actually been stuck in Western Ukraine, potentially waiting for the fighting to reach here. Now it hasn't yet, but it could do within a matter of weeks.
Is that the biggest concern? Like, is from sitting inside, is Russia's plan to go right from the east all the way to the west? Is that what's being said? I mean, and then what?
Well, honestly, we don't know what Russia's plan is yet entirely, but it does seem like they've gone for a very, very maximalist assault on the country, right? So you have, people were thinking, okay, maybe they're only going to break out in the east. Maybe they'll try and like make a land bridge from the occupied territories in the east, in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics that are recognized as independent through to Crimea. But no, it seemed like they decided to go for a maximalist assault that would take all of Ukraine. Now, Western Ukraine doesn't have a huge amount of military utility, so we assume they probably decided to leave that till last. But it does seem like they're being very, very held down in Kiev and in Kharkiv and in other places. It does seem they're making a bit more progress in the south than would be hopeful, and it does look like there was a bit of a breakthrough in the Donbass region. But so far, the Russians are moving slower than expected, and it might mean that they come to the negotiating table before they're able to take these parts of the country.
I'm wondering
is,
oh, you go, Jeremy.
Oh, no, I was going to ask, I mean, is there a sense they have announced that there are going to be negotiations on the Belarus border? I mean, is there any sort of sense of hope that anything's going to come of that?
Well, yes, people are, at least in Ukraine, are optimistic. They think that their military defense has been successful enough, and it's given the Kremlin enough of a bloody nose so far that we really, really aren't. That there really is some kind of hope that there could be a diplomatic breakthrough that just didn't exist 3 or 4 days ago. That said, the worry that people have is that if they don't come to terms, the Kremlin still has a huge amount of really, really heavy firepower. We're talking about thermobaric, missile launchers that, look like they come out of, I don't know, Call of Duty or something, but can inflict insane amounts of damage on civilian populations and in cities. And we know the Russians have been willing to use them before, as they did in Syria. Now, would they use them against Kiev, against Ukraine? That's a open question, but we just don't know for now.
What is happening in the civilian population, Tom? What are you saying? Because we're getting reports and seeing that there are some civilian fatalities. Is this indiscriminate? Is the attack happening everywhere? Or doesn't matter of the target, or are those civilians who are getting caught up in it the ones who are located in and around, for example, military installations?
Okay, so it seems that a few civilian targets have been hit, and there's definitely been cases of civilians caught up in the fighting, but there haven't been the huge scale civilian casualties that there could have been if they'd employed their kind of maximalist strategy of, they just use their long range missile systems to just kind of bomb the absolute hell out of, tower blocks and apartment buildings. And we know what this looks like because the Russians did it in Chechnya. The Russians also did it in Syria. And so far, they haven't done that in Ukraine, but it's only been 4 days so far. There's a school of thought that said, look, the Russians are going to be so angry that they've taken so many casualties that they didn't expect. They might decide to punish Ukraine in retaliation for its defiance, and that could look absolutely terrible. Or they could decide, we've messed up and we need to go back to the negotiating table and find a way to save face. It's anyone's guess as to which path they'll choose.
Hey, look, as a Kiwi coming from what is often said one of the most peaceful countries in the world, being New Zealand, this must be a total mindfuck for you. You hear stories about war correspondents, and you think Vietnam, you think World War II, and you think, what's been. How are you? I don't want to minimize the suffering that's happening with everybody else, but from a personal point of view, how are you handling this, and how are you dealing with this? What you're seeing and what you're having to report back?
Well, look, it's not my first rodeo. I have covered conflicts before. I was in Afghanistan for quite a while last year, and then the year before that, I covered the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I'm used to seeing, the kind of destruction and things that you do see in wars. I would just say that this is on a very, very different scale. And again, as I've spoken with a number of my correspondents, it was my choice to come here. It was my choice to do the work that I do. And for that reason, I can't honestly say that, it's my... I am more concerned for the people here who can't leave, who are stuck here, who this is their homes, than someone who came here by choice. Their career is something that I do for a profession and that I'm, rewarded for financially. So I don't want people to be having sympathy for me when they could be having sympathy for people in much more difficult situations who are still stuck in bomb shelters in Kiev in truly dire conditions.
Anything else, Jeremy?
No, I mean, I think that's yeah. I mean, it's incredible to hear from somebody who's right in the middle of it. It feels so distant for us, but at the same time, it's so immediate as well. It's terrifying what's happening there, and all I can say is stay safe and all the best with. Are you attempting to leave, or are you going to stay in Ukraine?
I have no plans to leave so far. No, I mean I'll probably go to the border tomorrow because I want to do a series of stories about the refugees, but I have no plans to leave Ukraine yet. I may even attempt to go back at least if the military situation stabilizes and there is a way to do so reasonably safely. But yeah, I feel I'm in for a penny and for a pound here.
Well, we need voices like yours, Tom. So stay safe, my friend.
Yeah, we'll let you go. And obviously, you being in the hostel there, speaking with hushed tones, we do appreciate your time, dude. Be safe, and we'll hopefully again catch up sometime soon.
Awesome, would love to. Okay,
all right. Cheers. Thanks, Tom. So that's Tom Much. He is actually in Ukraine right now, talking to us from what he's seeing, what's going on. Look, I want to play this bit, Jeremy, because I think it kind of speaks to some, at least some, if not all, of the Ukrainian attitude right now as well. We were talking about Afghanistan before, we were talking about Vietnam before. Many people may have seen this clip, but if you haven't, hopefully you'll enjoy it. It is subtitled, so you'll need to read along, but long story short, it's an interaction between what appears to be a very elderly, but who knows, that's numbers becoming less and less the older I get to be very elderly, a very elderly lady and a Russian soldier, and she is pretty blunt with her views around what they should and shouldn't be doing.
А хто ви такі? Які вчення? Звідки ви? Які вчення? Ви що, росіяни?
Да.
Якого хера ви тут робите?
Ну, сейчас наш с вами разговор ни к чему не приведет.
Вы оккупанты, вы фашисты, вы пришли на нашу землю.
Хорошо.
Какого хера вы пришли с оружием к
Кто
нам?
сказал?
Возьмите семечки, положите сырые,
Хорошо.
чтобы хоть подсолнухи росли, когда вы здесь
Хорошо.
ляжете.
Сейчас наш разговор ни к чему не приведет. Давайте не будем усугублять эту ситуацию. Пожалуйста.
Как усугублять
Пожалуйста,
ситуацию?
не будем усугублять ситуацию. Наш с вами
Ребята,
разговор ни к чему не
Ребята,
приведет.
положите в карманы
Ничего не
семечки.
решит наш с вами разговор.
Я поняла, положите семечки или
Хорошо.
семена цветов.
Я
Вы здесь семенами
я
ляжете.
сделаю.
Вы
Да,
пришли на мою землю.
Хорошо, я вас выслушал.
Вы понимаете?
Я вас
Вы
слышу.
оккупанты,
Хорошо.
вы враги.
Да,
И вы уже с этой секунды прокляты.
да,
Я вам отвечаю.
все. Теперь послушайте меня.
Я вас услышала.
Не будем усугублять ситуацию. Пройдите,
А
пожалуйста.
куда уже усугублять? Вы пришли, блядь, непрошенные
Хорошо.
твари, конченые.
I think we hear the phrase a lot, and Jeremy, you might need to turn your camera back the other way to get yourself back on horizontal view there. I think we hear the phrase a lot, gangster, and I have to say that woman is a fucking gangster, the likes of which I don't think we've ever seen before. If you didn't get necessarily the connection, and I'm sure you did, I'm not trying to tell you how to suck eggs for people watching that. She's basically saying, please put these sunflower seeds in your pockets, because when you die here on our land, you will become compost and sunflowers will grow where your body lies. Yeah. So you can see that analogy towards Afghanistan and Vietnam with that kind of response, Jeremy. We've lost your mic there, Jeremy. So we'll have to see what's going on there. I'm not sure what's happened on this end, but we will. What I'll do is, if you have a look and try and figure out your mic there, Jeremy, I'm actually going to also bring in George. Worst case scenario, Jeremy, you can jump off and jump back on if something's happened within the system, and you'll come back in probably beautiful and alive and alert for us, because for some reason your mic has disappeared. George, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I've got some thoughts on Ukraine.
Yeah, I was just double checking as well to make sure it was just Jeremy's mic, because it doesn't seem to be working on his end. Just jump in and jump out. Let me just try Jeremy one more time, and then we can jump to you. Back with us, Jeremy?
No.
Yeah, no, we've lost you there, mate. So just hang up, like exit the room, Jeremy, and then reconnect, and we'll see if that solves whatever just happened there. Now, George, for people who are just joining us, to introduce George is working with us on Big Hero News. He is on behind the scenes. He's always around. He's the producer of the news and the information that you're seeing, but you also have some views and thoughts and research, and also you've studied in and around the Ukraine. So I'd love to hear from you, George.
That's right. Yeah, I think probably what the most interesting thing, and Tom was covering this a little bit in the interview, is probably that resistance that Ukraine. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised, as Jeremy and Tom were discussing, that people are defending their homeland, right? They're and they're going to be strong about that. They're going to be tough when it comes to that. But I think the Russians especially are surprised by the resistance, right? I think the thinking was that the military in Ukraine and the more pro-Russian elements of Ukrainian politics would jump in, get rid of the current government, and basically surrender and install a Russian puppet, right? And this hasn't happened. This was meant to happen overnight, right? Literally at night, and this hasn't happened. So as Tom was saying there, possibly that leads to either negotiations, a path of negotiations, or a path of even more brutality. Yeah, we got Jeremy back. Audio.
Have we got you back, Jeremy, officially? Not hearing you, mate. So not quite sure what's actually happened, what's going on there. Whilst we're having a look at that, also just to let people know that coming up at 1:45, so in 15 minutes, if you're watching this live, Professor Robert Patman's going to be joining us to probably talk about the Ukraine issue and what's going on there as well. Shall we move to what's happening in the other big news story of the day, which is officially what's happening with Omicron in New Zealand at the moment and what's happening at the border. I'm just going to say again, Jeremy, I don't think we've got you because I can't hear the cicadas anymore. Something's kind of coming and going there. If that's your end, Jeremy, I'm not sure. If you've got us on your phone and if you've got those headphones plugged into your phone, maybe you could just pull those out and maybe that would be a connection that would then work. I'm not sure. So, but let's just have a look at what's going on. I'll keep listening out for the cicadas, Jeremy, and that's how we know we've got you back. Because Jeremy's in Auckland and we're in Dunedin, aren't we, George?
Yes.
So I've forgotten what that sounds like, that sound of cicadas. I'm interested to get people's thoughts around what's happening. Oh, we'll just actually, before we go into that, let's go and have a look at one comment that's come in from Crazy Old World talking about we've talked about. It's unbelievable that in 2022, that ego was enough to cause a war in Europe. The UN needs a complete overhaul and the right of veto must go. That's an interesting point about the right to veto, about some powers.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, just to quickly finish on Ukraine for now, I think in terms of, motivations and rationales for the Russian invasion, policy analysts and scholars and stuff, they're speculating, but there was a bit of confusion about why now for Putin to make this decision, right? The conflict's sort of been a the phrase frozen conflict is sort of thrown around, right, for the past 8 years. And then suddenly, sort of out of the blue for observers, I'm sure people there weren't surprised, but he decided to invade. And so there's speculation that this is really a project of Putin's, right, rather than project of him and political allies in Russia, that he's getting old, he's getting isolated, he's getting paranoid, and that this was a last-ditch effort to create some sort of legacy, almost. And then, the stuff about the Security Council veto, that's, obviously been a huge issue for years and years, the US vetoing resolutions around Israel-Palestine, China vetoing resolutions around Taiwan or the Uyghurs, and then obviously now with Russia and Ukraine. It just shows how broken the Security Council is, right? And that it was created by the victors of World War II, and it serves them. It continues to do so. Yeah.
I'm not sure if we'll get Jeremy back or not, but if we do, we'd love to have him. And if we don't, he's added some nice questions and stuff to that original conversation. Let's move on to Omicron. We are going to come back to Ukraine when Robert Patman joins us. But Omicron at the moment, the government's under more political pressure to ease border restrictions. Political pressure is mounting on the government to move faster on easing border restrictions as the domestic outbreak escalates. I was saying the other day, let's give Jeremy one more shot. Jeremy, you with us?
Hey, I believe so. Yeah, that was strange. Yeah. It kept telling me my mic was working, but obviously it wasn't. So
Yeah. All right, mate. Hey, listen, we were just starting to talk about the border cases. I'd like your thoughts around this because I'm struggling a little bit with the rationale for these restrictions entirely, because it appears that we've spent 2 years being cautious, and then when there's this fucking explosion of COVID, albeit statistically less serious, but still serious, it feels like the government's going, nah, let's just get into it now. And from doing the research, looking around the world using that World Info COVID website, it seems that the COVID, bell curve is about 4 weeks. So I have to say I'm confused as to why this government has been so tight on restrictions for 2 years, and then arguably when there's a 4-week window for us to wait, they've kind of thrown it open and said we'll figure this out. You got any thoughts around that, Jeremy?
Well, I think I kind of agree with you, but I do also think it was getting harder and harder to justify MIQ in its existing form. When you've got, there was a day last week where we had 9 cases at the border and over 12,000 in the community.
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, at the moment, particularly in Auckland, where I live, you're far more likely to pick up COVID at Mitre 10 than you are from being on an international flight from Australia, just statistically. So I think, their rationale was always to try and open the borders. Standing around now, I was a little surprised how quickly it happened overnight. But I think it's just a case of, it's a justification. And, it'll be fascinating to see what happens if, God forbid, we get yet another variant, whether they have to slam the borders closed again. But yeah, I think in some ways they have bowed to a little bit of pressure, which is something this government's actually been quite staunch in not doing over the last couple of years. But I think in this case, the justification was just getting a little, even people like myself who, I'm a big supporter of how this has been handled, of the restrictions that have been in place. I think they've done a terrific job, but the MIQ was becoming harder and harder to kind of sit. It just didn't quite sit right. I
think the MIQ is one side of it, but I have to be honest with you and say that the new monitoring system, how we can now self-monitor and close contacts or family members have to go and isolate, but any other close contacts don't. That's part of the thing I'm confused about as well, because what that's going to mean is the numbers are going to explode more so than they would have. I had a person in the house who was a close contact of someone from outside the house, and their kind of 5-day window would have been during that changeover. And so it was a bit confusing for that person. But I thought if the person who was in my house was a close contact of that situation, then they, if they had got it now, then basically they didn't have to do anything other than monitor themselves. And forgive me for being a bit of a pessimist, but when people monitor themselves, they lie and they will turn up to places with scratchy throats and they'll go, it's just a cold. And I'll just say again, even keeping it to those regulations of close contacts also needs to self-isolate for 5 days. I think I don't understand why all of a sudden we've just flung open that option as well. There's 2 logical reasons. One is it's political pressure, and that frustrates me because it feels like this whole 2 years it's been health decisions first, and now it feels a little bit like political decision first. So that's either hypocritical or it means they're being too heavy-handed for the last 12 months. Really, those 2 things, it feels like it has to be one or other of those 2 things. Someone did say to me the other day, and I think it's a very smart consideration, is maybe we've had to go to this form of isolation because if we didn't, the whole of the country would be isolated again. I'm not a close contact, but I know people who are close contacts. And perhaps if we had to stay with that path, perhaps there would be people isolating in every house in New Zealand because everyone knows someone who's got it, or every household knows at least one person outside that household who's got it. And I guess that could be a consideration, that if they didn't do it, we're basically going back into lockdown anyway.
Yeah, well, I can tell you from Auckland over the last week has felt like we're in a voluntary lockdown. It's a ghost town. The traffic is down to virtually nothing. I went to a local, my golf club actually, which has an enormous car park, which is normally full. People park there to commute. It was empty. This is 2 days ago. So in many ways, I can't speak for the rest of the country, but Auckland absolutely feels like we've voluntarily gone into, I'd say, where we were at level 3.5 under the old system. And if you think about the numbers, realistically, we have, over 20,000 confirmed cases active in the community in Auckland who are isolating, hopefully, plus their household contacts, plus close contacts waiting for test results. So yeah, I mean, maybe, I think in many ways that is what's happening. I'm with you though. I don't quite understand the decision to kind of fast track us into this next tier. I'm a bit confused about the tier levels, to be honest, at the moment. The Omicron level 3 or whatever it's called. I am a little confused about it. I agree with you that the rationale. It is worth remembering that the plan a few months ago was to reopen the Australian border in mid-February. And that was put off by a couple of weeks. And then to have this rolling reopening of the border over the next 2 to 3 months, reopening to safe countries, to certain other countries, and then eventually to the rest of the world by kind of middle of this year. Whether that's on track, I mean, we're just going to have to wait and see, I suppose.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, the thing is, it's 4 weeks. Like, this is Australia, right? This is obviously the Omicron spike. And if you have a look, sort of start of January is when it started going up, started coming down, start of February. So what I'm saying is, for the sake of being more secure for 4 weeks, have they possibly given up on the good work of 2 years? That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only justification I can have for it is just the numbers. The fact that our border numbers have been consistently low for a couple of weeks now, whereas our community numbers, and again, it's just the justification. I mean, whether it's the right decision, I guess, time will tell. I guess the biggest fear is that there's another variant out there that, there's reports that there is a new variant coming out of South Africa, which is where these all seem to be starting at the moment. And we'll just, time will.
Yeah. Look, we've got Robert Patman coming up probably in 5 minutes or so, but very quickly, I'd be interested to get your thoughts around what's happening at Parliament still. I want to play something actually, and this is, I'm a strong believer that if you scratch the surface for long enough of people who are anti-mandate protesters, most of them, eventually you get to a pretty significant conspiracy theory. So if you keep scratching and saying, why is that? What the kind of foundation of everything is lizard people, microchips, Bill Gates, yada, yada, yada. Now, I'm not identifying who this person is. I'm on their Facebook page. That's why I've made it full screen. But I'd like people just to hear an example of one of the people, and only one person, may not be representative, at the protest talking about their children who have gotten sick at the protest.
Really quickly, the kids are having a sleep. I was having a sleep. Sanders woke up today. He felt unwell. So I gave him some Pamol and he had a 2-hour sleep and he was okay. And I was like, shit. Okay. But it's, obviously radiation poisoning. Like, people were like, oh, maybe it's the food. No, he's a picky little bastard. He only eats sausages and I've been making him noodles and fucking skitty for the last couple of days, let's be honest.
So that's probably enough to hear from that. But I don't know if you could hear it clearly or entirely, but it's obviously radiation poisoning. So I think that this is what we're seeing at I've been saying it for weeks that, well, it is weeks now. The anti-mandate protesters are actually anti-vaccine protesters. They're allowed to be anti-vaccine protesters, but they're sort of couching their opposition to the mandate and civil rights, but actually they're just scratched far enough, and you get to the government is shooting us with radiation from the beehive. Yeah, look, I actually, I've got to the point where you almost have to feel sorry for genuine protesters who are down, the ones who do believe, in civil rights, and because there are some, there are some out there, but even they must be looking around. When the tinfoil hats appeared, I'm a comedian, I couldn't make that up. Sure. Satire is officially dead. When you've got standing outside the beehive, literally, when Thornton New World has run out of tinfoil. In some ways it's hilarious. In other ways, it's very sad. I read a report from a frontline police officer down there recently where he was saying there's a lot of people who are there just because they want to feel like they're part of something. They want to be surrounded. They're lonely in many ways. They want to be surrounded by other people who they believe that they have something in common with. But the problem with this protest right from the beginning is that it has been
such an umbrella group. I mean, it's covering when you, like I say, if you are genuinely down there because you're worried about civil rights and government intervention, then all power to you. But if you're standing next to somebody carrying a swastika flag, and you're standing next to somebody else with a kill list of politicians and media journalists that they think should be killed, you're on the wrong side of history. And I guess, I mean, the confusion for so many of us is how it's been allowed to go on for so long. Is, if you look at the history of protests in this country, you would sort of think the police would have done something else. I mean, it's happening in Auckland now. We've got people camped out in the Domain. It's happening down in Dunedin, I hear. It is. It's worrying. It's sad. It's unintentionally funny at times. When I first heard EMF were going, I thought they just added "Unbelievable" to the playlist out front of Parliament.
A good song.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a classic one-hit wonder. But yeah, you're right. You scratch the surface, and you have these conspiracy theories, this QAnon fueled nonsense, and it's dividing people. I mean, I've lost friends down the rabbit hole. I've lost family members down the rabbit hole overseas to these things, and I just have to cross my fingers and hope that when we come out of this, whenever that may be at the other end, that those bridges can be mended. But I spent so much time this week. Removing people from my Facebook friends list and muting people, and because it's exhausting. I always go back when it comes to arguing with some of these people. I go back to the late great Mitch Hedberg, who had a joke: "Is no matter how good you are at tennis, you're never going to be better than a wall. Those fuckers are relentless." And that's what it feels like. It feels like you're just banging, hitting against the wall, and it just keeps coming back. And no one's going to win that argument.
Someone says, Emperor Val says, I don't even know if to scratch far. When I saw tinfoil hats, I thought it was just them taking the piss. So I agree with Jeremy that protesters are swamped by the alt-right. I think the protesters at the moment, in my opinion, is it seems that, I don't know what the opposite of Occam's razor is, but most people think about Occam's razor as, the most obvious conclusion is more often not the correct conclusion. The actual thing it says is it's the fewest number of assumptions to get to an outcome. That's what Occam's razor. It seems that the protesters take the most amount of assumptions to get to their conclusion. So whatever the opposite of Occam's razor is, that seems that's what the protesters in Parliament are doing right now. So, hey, but we have Robert.
If you just think that oh, sorry, great, go.
Yeah, let's jump in. Let's jump in because Robert's with us. I was going to say to you, Robert, hello and welcome, Professor Robert Patman. You don't seem to have your camera on. That's fine. If there's no camera, we can just audio, or you can turn it on. We want to see your beautiful face if you want to.
Well, sorry, I've had problems with my laptop, which I normally use in these situations, and that's caused me problems this morning. So I'm on my desktop. So I appreciate. Sorry, I don't usually. Yeah.
100% fine. We can just talk to you on the audio. It makes literally no difference whatsoever. So Robert, we've been talking about what's going on today, or actually in the recent days with the Ukraine. We've just had Tom Much on live out of the UK and giving us a bit of a personal first-hand experience of what he can see and what's going on. I guess I just want to kind of give the floor to you for a minute and share your views as an expert sort of in foreign policy and foreign politics as to what's going on. For people who aren't aware who Robert is, Professor of Politics from Otago University, and we'd love to get your thoughts, Robert.
Well, yes. I mean, where to start, really? Mr. Putin has been steadily building this invasion force up for a long time. And the Biden administration did something quite interesting. They started declassifying intelligence in quite a substantial way. They weren't alone. The UK did the same. And that caused some teeth grinding, by the way, with the intelligence community, because they always worry about compromising sources, particularly sources within an authoritarian political system like Russia has at the moment. But the interesting thing about the warnings of invasion, remember, it was about 10 days ago that Mr. Putin dismissed the idea that there'd be any invasion of Ukraine. The fact that the United States made these repeated warnings, I think, did two things. First of all, it's complicated Mr. Putin's decision making. I mean, ideally, he probably would have liked the world to be caught by surprise by the invasion. But secondly, and most importantly, it set up a bit of a debate within Russia. Several senior Russian military sources, now retired, but presumably with close links to those serving in the Russian military. Under Russian law, those serving can't speak on political matters, but those retired can. So they may be acting as a bit of a reflection of some of the concerns. Now, two senior military people, and I mean very senior, warned Putin against invading the Ukraine, said it would be a catastrophe. It would not be a tea party. The Ukrainians would resist, and that Mr. Putin, amongst other things, was grossly underestimating the hostility towards Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also Eastern Europe generally.
Robert,
yeah.
we've actually got a clip here from one of Putin's head spies. This may be what you're talking about, or it may be just running alongside it. Even though you're on your desktop, can you see us? Are we coming through loud and clear?
Yes, I can see it. Yeah, sorry, I apologize.
That's right. No, it's no problems at all. I'll play this because obviously it's in Russian, so people are going to have to read the subtitles. But this might be a bit of what you're speaking about, because if you watch this conversation between Putin and his chief spy, or one of his chief spies, you can almost see the intense fear within the chief spy's conversation, that he realized who he's talking to and what he's saying to him. So let me just play this. Oh, look, there's Robert. Hey, Robert. Beautiful.
Yeah, my fault. Sorry, I've suddenly realized I'm not very good with the technical stuff. So yeah.
So let's just play this, and you can speak to this after that, Robert. Jeremy, you can jump in as well, and we'll see what people have got to say.
Согласился бы с предложением Николая Платоновича о том, что нашим, так сказать, западным партнерам можно дать последний шанс с тем, чтобы предложить им в кратчайшие сроки заставить Киев пойти на мир и выполнить Минские соглашения. В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится.
Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет их?
А я
говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение...
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Поддерживаю предложение о вхождении Донецкой и Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Да, мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да, я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо. Владимир Александрович.
So I don't know about other people and how they feel about Putin, but Robert, to have the chief spy fumble over so many words, to then actually have to finally come out and say he supports independence, is that the kind of advice you're talking about? That is very difficult.
Well, that's a slightly separate issue, if I may say so, Pat, but it's very important. And that is that Mr. Putin is possibly operating in a bubble. Well, in fact, we know he is. Because not only has he removed most effective political opposition, but he has concentrated ever more power in his own hands, which means even his top advisors, as you've just seen there, tremble if they think they're contradicting him. There's real fear. But the downside of that is, after 22 years in power as president or prime minister, Mr. Putin is not always getting the unvarnished truth. He's not getting robust, independent advice. No one's saying to him, Mr. President, you're talking nonsense. The Ukrainians will never accept Russian rule willingly over their country. So he's not hearing that. But yeah, I think to come back to what we were talking about, Mr. Putin's got himself in a very difficult situation now, because whatever the reasons, he's now invaded Russia. And I think his initial strategy was based on a blitzkrieg, a quick overrunning of the country. They seem to be bogged down. It's only 3 or 4 days into the conflict, and on paper, they should overwhelm Ukraine. I still think they probably will. It will take longer. But you know what? That is still a losing situation for President Putin, because even if he overthrows the government, he is not going to be able to install a pro-Russian government in Ukraine that has the consent of the people there. Yeah. In other words, he's probably even if he takes over the whole country, changes the government, is going to be faced with a vibrant insurgency that's going to cost him a lot of money to contain. Money he won't have after the devastating moves over the weekend. The fact that Russia's been disconnected from the vital financial transactions, I think it's called SWIFT, that banks operate under. The Russian markets are bracing themselves for the impact of that Monday morning. So I think he's also indicated he's made a sort of another veiled nuclear threat. But I think that's a reflection of his own frustrations with how things are going to some degree. He's also sort of using nuclear blackmail to Western Europe to say, look, you better let me have my way in Ukraine. Otherwise, I might escalate further. I think there is signs of major divisions within Russia breaking out. It's very difficult to measure this in an authoritarian system. We've seen lots of protests, by the way. Doctors have very bravely formed a petition against the war. So there's quite a lot of people have been arrested in Russia protesting. But it's an extraordinary situation. You see, Mr. Putin have told himself he's had an obsession with Russia going back to 2008, maybe 2007, when he told an astonished George W. Bush, when Bush was president, that Ukraine was not a proper country. And he's reconfirmed that a week ago when he said, in a speech justifying the invasion or just before the invasion, he said that Ukraine was a creation of Russia and Ukraine currently occupies ancient lands of Russia. So he doesn't recognize it, in Putin's eyes, he doesn't recognize Ukraine as a legitimate sovereign country. He sees it as, from his eyes, he's not violating anyone's sovereignty. That's why he doesn't use the word invasion. He's simply reclaiming what he believes belongs to Russia.
He's going home.
Yeah. Problem is 45 million people plus disagree with it. And it's a very serious situation. And also one has to worry about his judgment at this stage.
I've seen quite a lot of commentators suggest that this could be the beginning of the end for Putin's reign. I mean, do you think that's realistic or is that optimistic?
No, I've taken that view for some time. I think it's a catastrophic misjudgment, Jeremy. The thing is, unilateral use of military power by superpowers has a very poor track record in the post-Cold War era. I can't think of any successful use. Even Crimea was a disaster for Mr. Putin, although he doesn't acknowledge it, because the sanctions that resulted from the annexation of Crimea in 2014 devastated the Russian economy. The Russian economy didn't grow for 2 years after that, but it contracted by 2.3% in 2015, 2016. So, you have to question his judgment. I think Mr. Putin has a view of international politics which is grounded in the 19th century, where great powers call the shots. He kept talking about the problems he was having with the Ukraine government, but he never sat down with President Zelensky and tried to hammer out a solution. He kept going to President Biden. He kept trying to engage the Americans. And I think he has set in motion a situation which he could well blow back on him. And lots of young Russians are dying and young Ukrainians. This is a tragic situation. And what was it all about? It was about shoring up Putin's political base in Moscow.
Right.
He was extremely concerned. The last thing he wants is a vibrant democracy next door in Ukraine. He's already been rattled by signs of popular protest in neighboring Kazakhstan and Belarus. And Ukraine presented a particular threat because, ironically, since Russia annexed Crimea, that has pushed Ukraine further towards the Western camp. And so it is a problem. I think it may take a year or so, but I think unless he can quickly retrieve this situation, unless he can make a military breakthrough relatively soon, he could well find Russia ensnared in a very messy conflict. And I think there's already opposition to him within the Russian military sector. Apparently, some of the troops are not fighting particularly well in Ukraine. Some of them are demoralized and wondering what they're doing there. And as I say, this is a situation, even dictators, and he is basically a dictator, can come a cropper. After all, lots of people are dying from a decision he's made. And I don't think some people, it might be some within his regime or within his entourage, decides to make a move. But I personally think that protests, as the economy comes under strain, will multiply. So I think Mr. Putin has probably overextended himself and will probably pay the price politically.
Hey, Robert, it would be really good to touch base with you a few times this week. We're doing this daily now for people who are watching us or who are going to watch us on demand. We're going to try and do this daily at about 11 o'clock every morning. I do have can I ask you a tangent question? Because I've just thought of something. It's to do with Russia, Ukraine, but it's sort of more about world politics and world policy. So here's the question. World leaders unanimously would identify the Ukraine as a sovereign country, independent state, actual real country, and that Russia is wrong. That statement would be correct?
Yeah. And that was the case of Russia. Let's be quite clear. In 1994, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, it did so in return from a solemn pledge from Boris Yeltsin's government that they fully recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine and its sovereign independence. And so Mr. Putin's actually violated a pledge given by a previous Russian government. So yes, that is the case. And I think the evidence of the fighting, the proof, the old saying, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. The Ukrainians, if Ukraine was really part of Russia, then they wouldn't be encountering the resistance they're encountering, which is ferocious resistance. They're literally prepared to fight for every house in Kiev and Kharkov and other Ukrainian cities.
So the question I have for you, that is a big tangent, and I get that, but it's something I don't know too much about the kind of the history of this, which is why I'm asking it. So if the world leaders see Ukraine as an independent sovereign country, a real country, state, and Russia is wrong, why do we get so many world leaders fumbling and stumbling over Taiwan? Because can't you ask the same question? Taiwan is a sovereign, independent country, a real country, etc., etc., etc. But leaders won't stand up and say, no, China's wrong. The reason I asked this was I asked this question to James Shaw and I had him on a podcast last year, and he kind of wouldn't answer the question. And so I left it because I'm not a rude person. But I'm interested if the world leaders see Russia wrong, Jeremy, I heard you laugh there, Jeremy, Ukraine being an independent state country, why won't they do the same with China and Taiwan? I get it tangent, but it just interests me.
Yeah. And that question is becoming increasingly more of a burning one because Taiwan has demonstrated that it's a vibrant democracy. And also in the last election, the Chinese did quite significantly interfere to try to support the opponent to the person who won. So yeah, it is a very important question. I suppose to some degree, Taiwan hasn't declared independence. If it declared itself an independent state, then that would probably change things a bit. It would change things a great deal. Of course, the Chinese have made it quite clear that should Taiwan declare independence, then they'll be taking some sort of action. But of course, China's watching this situation in Ukraine very carefully. But you know what? They are very nervous about what a lot of people are assuming, that the Chinese are fully behind the Russians. I don't think that's the case. I think they've got measured support for Russia. They both have authoritarian systems. And they both want to act as counterweights to the United States. They don't want the US being all dominant at the international level. But China, let's be quite clear about this, its rise to superpower status is entirely due to its full-blooded participation in the world capitalist system. So China is in a different situation to Russia. First of all, it's a genuine superpower. Russia is a regional power with heavily armed regional power. Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. China's economy is set to overtake the United States economy in aggregate terms by about 2028. I think China, it was also alarmed, is getting increasingly alarmed by what's happening in Ukraine. China has over 10 billion in terms of investments in Ukraine. So the sight of Ukraine being smashed up with these missile attacks is causing problems. Also, they were not particularly, I imagine, they weren't particularly pleased when Mr. Putin suddenly recognized the independence of separatist groups within the territorial space of Ukraine. Why? Well, they may worry that outside powers may suddenly recognize the independence of Uyghurs in China, or may go and recognize the independence of Taiwan.
Or Tibet.
So, you know, the Chinese, their position in international relations is they are very keen, they're very conservative, they're very keen on sovereignty and respecting it. And they have been saying they still uphold support for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So, you know, I think China's trying to have it both ways at the moment.
Right.
It's trying to indicate to Mr. Putin they understand his concerns, but he should settle them peacefully if possible. And I also think it's a marriage of convenience. I don't think it's one of principle. I think China does not regard Russia as an equal. I think Mr. Putin would like to be treated as an equal, but I don't think he's going to get that from the Chinese. And the other thing is they may be viewing Russia as a commercial opportunity, because if the Russians are really squeezed, where can they go? They can go to China, and China will say, oh, thank you very much. But evidence of that occurred when the sanctions went on after the Crimean invasion, where Mr. Putin had to go cap in hand to Beijing for a gas deal. And guess what? It was a deal very much in Chinese commercial terms, very favorable in Chinese commercial terms. So there's no room for sentiment when it comes to business as far as Chinese are concerned. So I'm skeptical about the big coalition between China and Russia.
Jeremy, anything you want to wrap up with? Because we're done pretty much. Robert, it'll be good to talk to you again later on today. Got anything you want to add in, Jeremy?
No, that was really useful. Terrific insight in there. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Hey, Robert, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, sorry about the camera, but
no, but look, this is our first show. We've had people dropping in and dropping out and doing all sorts of crazy things along the way. Robert, I'll be in touch, and because of what's going on in the Ukraine, hopefully we'll talk to you again, possibly even this week if you've got the time to do that. So we appreciate your time, Robert Patman, Professor Robert Patman from Otago University. Jeremy, that's us. We're done. First one down. Maybe, hopefully, first of thousands. Maybe it'll fall over and it'll be first of three. But thank you so much for jumping in. Let's bring Georgie back in as well. George, still there with us, producing behind the background, sending me a whole bunch of references and resources in the private chat, of which I got to none. So I apologize about that, George, but I can see them in there now. And for people who were watching in the live stream, what we are aiming on doing is one of these everyday live stream at 11. Kind of 11 till 12. Today it's 7 past 12 now, so it's a bit over because, you know, who am I to cut off Professor Robert Patman? Just saying.
Exactly.
But this is what we want to do, and we want to get the news out to you. If you are still watching this and you want to be involved, the best thing you can do is share our content. I will be getting off this live stream and I'll be cutting up some of the clips from this. I'll be putting them on the YouTube channel. Let me put the YouTube channel up there so people know where it is. That one. So it's the DOC NZ Studios YouTube channel. The best thing you can do to help us is to share our content, to tell people what we're doing, to let them know what we're all about. People like Jeremy will be on. Penny Ashton's coming on tomorrow. We've got people joining us to be co-hosts. We've got people, as you've seen today. Today, if you're just joining us, we were live in the Ukraine and we had Robert Patman. So we've got contributors that are going to add to the news of the day. And it's called BHN, Big Hairy News. We want to get into it, and thanks everyone for joining in. And as I say, that horrible YouTube thing about like and subscribe, but the reality is just tell people about us. Share our shit. That's going to be our tagline, George. Share our shit. I like
Sounds
that.
good.
We'll use that from now on.
Catchy.
Anything you want to wrap up with, Jeremy?
No, thanks for having me on, and hopefully I'll join you again sometime with maybe a bit more notice and a bit more technological know-how next time.
Yeah, no, look, today was great. I mean, yes, there were a few glitches. It's the first time we've done it. This is kind of a soft launch. Share our shit.
kidding.
That's what we're saying now, George. That's official.
Yeah, share it.
And
Share the shit.
if you're someone who's jumped on board and you're watching and you then subscribe to the YouTube channel, that's the main place it's going to be, is the YouTube channel. So I know if you watch the podcast and stuff that I do, that's on Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and Twitter. The main place this is going to be is on the YouTube channel. So that's the best place to subscribe and share our shit. And yeah, it's been a blast. Thank you, George. I appreciate your work. Me and George have been talking about this for a month or so. Thank you for jumping on board late notice here, Jeremy. And we will see all you fellas and fella S's tomorrow from around about 11 a.m. right here. So come back and join. And remember, we always want your contributions and to share your thoughts while we're live as well, because we will share some of them as we go along. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, George. We'll catch you next time.